St. Clair County 911. What's the location?
911!
Margaret's son, David Lee Sumney Jr., killed her, staged the scene with disturbing selfies, and kept it hidden for days. Why? The image of Junior smiling with his mother's lifeless body, blood splattered across the room. What drove him to this cold-blooded act, and why did he think he could get away with it? Margaret Ann Sumney wasn't just a mother. She was the heart of her community. A graceful woman who built her life around dance, she had a vibrant spirit that could light up any room. Growing up, she learned the art of movement from her parents, who owned a beloved local dance studio in Pennsylvania. Margaret didn't just teach. She lived and breathed the rhythm of the studio, spending long hours perfecting performances, organizing recitals, and shaping young dancers. As an instructor, she was adored by her students and respected by her peers. Margaret's energy was contagious, and her passion for the art was matched only by her love for her family. Known for her warmth, her ability to connect with others, and her infectious laugh, she wasn't just a mother to her own children, but a second mother to many. The dance studio was more than just a business. It was her legacy, one she hoped to pass on to her daughters, Helen and Peg. But as life took its toll, Margaret's family bond remained strong, except with her son Junior, who had become increasingly distant. On September 1, 2019, the day after the family received tragic news about the passing of Margaret's brother, John Shade, her family began reaching out to her. A phone call from one of her sisters to Margaret went unanswered. This wasn't like Margaret. She was always on top of things, keeping close contact with her siblings. So, when the calls didn't go through, the tension began to build. It was only when Margaret's eldest daughter, Helen, started making calls that they began to worry. She tried calling several times, but still no answer. Finally, Helen reached Junior, expecting him to have an explanation or at least some information about her mother. Instead, she was met with a flat, emotionless response. Junior casually answered that his mother was sleeping. It was well past 9 a.m. by this time, and Margaret was known for her punctuality and attention to detail, especially when there was family news to discuss. Why would she still be asleep? It was completely out of character. Helen pressed Junior, asking why she couldn't speak to her mother. He insisted Margaret was asleep and suggested Helen should call back later. The lack of urgency, the dismissive tone, what didn't add up? Junior wasn't acting like someone concerned about a family loss or the state of their mother. Instead, his behavior felt off, distant, and curiously evasive. This wasn't the first time Junior had been difficult to reach, but it was the first time his behavior seemed so detached, so cold. What was he hiding? Why didn't he want anyone to see his mother? Was she really just sleeping? Or was something far more sinister going on? Helen couldn't shake the feeling that Junior's actions weren't just out of character, they were the first signs of something much darker, something that would soon be exposed. The phone call with Junior was the first sign that something was terribly wrong. The morning after hearing about the passing of their uncle, John Shade, the family was understandably shaken. They all needed to reach Margaret to discuss arrangements, but the calls went unanswered. The family wasn't too concerned at first, figuring she might have been busy or preoccupied. However, as the hours passed and Helen's calls went unanswered, her unease grew. Margaret was always reliable and never ignored important calls, especially when a family member had passed. After multiple attempts to reach her, Helen finally called Junior, hoping he could shed some light on why their mother wasn't responding. Junior picked up the phone in his usual disinterested manner, his voice devoid of warmth or emotion. When Helen asked to speak to her mother, Junior's reply was chilling in its nonchalance. "You're sleeping," he said. It was already past 9 a.m. Way too late for Margaret to still be asleep, especially given the circumstances. But Junior didn't seem the least bit concerned. He offered no apology for Margaret's absence, no urgency to pass along the message, just a simple, offhand remark. When Helen insisted on speaking with her mother, Junior responded evasively, telling her to call back later. This lack of urgency, paired with his odd indifference to the family tragedy, raised red flags. Why didn't Junior want anyone to speak to Margaret? Why wasn't he upset by the situation, like the rest of the family? The more Helen thought about it, the more she realized something wasn't right. His behavior felt distant, too controlled, too unemotional for someone who had just lost a close family member. Could it be that Junior was hiding something? Helen's instincts were sharp. honed over years of dealing with family dynamics and the challenges of growing up with Junior. She knew him well enough to understand that his behavior had been off for years. He had always been the difficult one, the one who refused to follow the rules or accept responsibility. But this cold detachment, this unwillingness to discuss the death of their uncle, felt like a different level of estrangement. As hours stretched into the day and Margaret still didn't answer the phone, Helen's worry turned to a gnawing anxiety. This wasn't just about a missed phone call, it was about the possibility that something had gone horribly wrong. Could Junior be hiding something more than just his mother's absence? The thought spiraled. Her gut told her that Junior's response wasn't just odd, it was a sign of something far darker. Helen wasn't one to ignore her instincts. She'd seen Junior lash out before, seen his erratic behavior, and witnessed his tendency to manipulate and avoid facing consequences, but this felt different. After another failed attempt to reach her mother, Helen made a choice. She couldn't let it go any longer. She needed answers, and she wasn't about to let Junior get away with dismissing her concerns. Feeling the weight of the situation on her shoulders, she called the police to request a welfare check on Margaret. Helen was terrified. Something was wrong, and it was only a matter of time before she uncovered the truth. Her call to the police was the beginning of the unraveling. What she didn't know yet was how chillingly close the answer was. When the officers arrived at Margaret's home, they were met with an unsettling quiet. The house was still, too still. The silence was oppressive, creating a tension that was palpable as they approached the door. After knocking several times with no response, they grew increasingly suspicious. Why would Margaret not answer? Could she be incapacitated, or worse? The officers, trained to respond to situations where something wasn't right, decided to force entry into the home. What they found inside confirmed their worst fears. The house, at first glance, appeared normal, but as they stepped inside, the scene immediately became suspicious. Bloodstains marred the floors, and drag marks led them to a bathroom upstairs. The unmistakable signs of a violent struggle were all around them, disturbing evidence that someone had fought for their life. The blood, scattered across multiple rooms, painted a gruesome picture of chaos and desperation. Towels stained dark with blood were carelessly discarded, while drag marks on the floor suggested an attempt to conceal something horrific. And then there was the sickle. Found lying near the bathroom, its blade stained dark with blood, it stood out like a sinister signature. The weapon, sharp and brutal, seemed out of place in a home like this. It wasn't a weapon you'd expect to find in a typical domestic dispute. It was the kind of weapon used to inflict a violent personal injury. And the blood, it told the story of a drawn-out struggle, not a quick, impulsive act. The scene was carefully planned, chaotic but deliberate. It wasn't just the aftermath of an argument gone wrong. It was the aftermath of a brutal, calculated act. As the investigation deepened, the authorities began sifting through the evidence in search of more clues that might explain what had happened. Among the things they found, one piece stood out above the rest: Junior's laptop. When investigators accessed it, they uncovered something that sent a chill down their spines. The search history was disturbing. Detailed instructions on how to clean up blood, how to erase traces of a crime, and methods of mummification. Articles about decomposing bodies, odor control, and how to avoid detection in residential settings flooded the screen. Helen had always believed in her brother, always hoped that deep down he could turn his life around, but the evidence, every piece of it, painted a picture of a man who had methodically orchestrated the destruction of their family. This was not the same boy she had once known, the boy who had been difficult but still part of their family unit. This was someone else entirely, someone who could look at his own mother's lifeless body and think nothing of posing for selfies beside her, nothing of staging the scene, nothing of the violence he had committed. It was horrifying to realize that Junior had thought of everything. He had researched how to clean up after the crime, how to hide the body, how to ensure no one would ever suspect him. For Helen, this was a betrayal on a level she couldn't have imagined. Her brother, the man she once trusted, had become a stranger, a cold, calculating killer. The horror of the situation sank in. Her worst fears had been realized, and yet the full scope of Junior's malice was still unfolding before her. But even as the pieces of the puzzle fell into place, there were still lingering questions. Why had Junior gone through such extreme lengths to stage the scene? Why had he carefully positioned Margaret's body and then taken those disturbing selfies, standing proudly beside the corpse? There was something almost taunting in the way he posed for the camera, as if daring anyone to figure out what had truly happened. The photos were chilling. They weren't the snapshots of someone in shock or in a panic. They were deliberate, posed images. Junior, smiling or looking indifferent, standing next to his dead mother, as though nothing were out of the ordinary. The more investigators looked at the photos, the more unsettling they became. These weren't just pictures taken in the aftermath of a crime. They were part of Junior's sick plan. He wanted to leave a mark, to make sure his involvement was clear, but in a way that no one could immediately connect the dots. These selfies, taken at intervals throughout the house, were Junior's way of documenting the scene. They weren't just images, they were evidence of his twisted pride in his actions. What did these photos mean? Was it a sick desire to prove he could commit the perfect crime? Or was it something else entirely? Something more sinister, like a need to control the narrative. The more the investigation uncovered, the more chilling it became. Junior hadn't just committed a murder, he had staged an entire show around it. And that made the case even more disturbing. As the investigation reached its peak, the damning evidence began to unfold in slow, agonizing waves. Junior's calculated, cold manipulation, his intricate planning, his chilling detachment, was no longer just speculation. It was in the photos, in the digital evidence, and in the forensic details that the full scope of his depravity became clear. The images, taken on Junior's phone and laptop, were more than just eerie mementos. They were a stark display of his twisted pride. Each selfie, each calculated pose beside his mother's lifeless body, revealed a person devoid of remorse, a person who had orchestrated every detail with meticulous precision. It wasn't the panicked act of a murderer who had lost control. This was someone playing a game, savoring the moment, and almost daring anyone to uncover the truth. Junior had staged the crime scene with care, almost as if he were trying to craft a perfect tableau, a grim masterpiece of murder. The sickle found near Margaret's body wasn't just a weapon. It was a tool in his orchestrated plan. It had been placed deliberately, its dark stain set as if it were a signature, an unspoken declaration of his involvement. He hadn't just killed his mother in a moment of rage. He had spent time thinking through how the scene would unfold, how he would conceal the murder, how he would position the body, and most chillingly, how he would present himself in the aftermath. As investigators combed through Junior's laptop, they uncovered search histories filled with chilling topics: how to clean up after a murder, how to remove biological evidence, and how to hide a body without leaving traces. His actions weren't born from anger or emotional distress. They were born from cold calculation, the desire to get away with murder without anyone ever suspecting him. Junior had mapped out every move he made, planned the crime, and even considered how he might escape the consequences. But there was more. His fabrications ran deeper than just his criminal actions. The search results also revealed another layer to Junior's deception: his lie about joining the U.S. Navy. For months, Margaret had been led to believe her son was on a path of redemption. Junior had spun a web of lies, claiming he had enlisted in the Navy and was on a trajectory toward discipline and order. In reality, he had never been recruited. There were no records, no military service, no documents. Only the lies he told to keep his mother in the dark. Junior had played his mother for years, manipulating her into believing he was on the verge of turning his life around. Margaret, blind to his true nature, had bought into the fantasy. She had been the one to defend him, to shield him from the consequences of his actions, and to maintain the facade of a family that was just going through a rough patch. But what she couldn't see, what she refused to see, was the monster that her son had become. The emotional weight of the investigation landed hardest on Margaret's family, especially her daughter Helen. The revelation that Junior, her own flesh and blood, had carefully plotted his mother's death was a blow that shattered any remaining illusions of family ties. Helen had spent years hoping, praying, that her brother would one day change, that the erratic, dangerous behaviors he exhibited would someday be replaced with maturity and accountability. She had been there for him when others had given up, supporting him through his failures and missteps, believing that somewhere inside, Junior still had the potential to be a better person. But now, standing on the precipice of this truth, Helen realized that her hopes had been in vain. Junior hadn't just failed to change. He had grown more dangerous, more manipulative, and more calculating. The devastation for Helen wasn't just the murder of her mother. It was the realization that she had been complicit in Junior's web of lies. by giving him chance after chance, by overlooking the warning signs she had helped enable him. She had believed his excuses, defended his actions, and kept the family together despite the cracks in the foundation. But now, those cracks had ruptured wide open, exposing the ugliness that lay beneath the surface. For Margaret, the tragedy was even more profound. She had been the one to show her son love, unyielding support, and unwavering belief in his potential. She had always tried to make him feel that he was the center of her world, bending over backward to accommodate him, even when his behavior suggested otherwise. Her relationship with Junior had always been one of guilt and indulgence. Margaret believed that her failure to control her son during his youth had led to his problems. She thought that by continuing to give in to his demands, she could make up for the lost years, hoping that love and attention would heal him. But love, when unbalanced and unchecked, can sometimes blind a person to the true nature of those they care about most. Margaret's refusal to accept that her son had become a monster, someone capable of extreme violence, was a fatal mistake. She had seen the warning signs: Junior's cruelty to animals, his cold detachment, his aggressive outbursts, but she dismissed them, choosing instead to view them as phases or misunderstandings. This denial, this constant defense of Junior, enabled him to continue down a path of destruction unchecked. In her final moments, Margaret had failed to recognize that the person she had spent years trying to save was beyond saving. She had given him everything: her trust, her resources, her unyielding love. And in return, he had murdered her, carefully constructing a crime scene to cover up his guilt. The realization that she had been blinded by her love, that her nurturing instincts had inadvertently allowed him to escape justice for so long, hit like a thunderbolt. Margaret's death was not just a tragedy. It was the culmination of years of enabling behavior, where the love that should have protected her had in fact allowed the monster she had created to flourish. The true horror of this case wasn't just in the murder itself. It was in what had allowed it to happen. A mother's love, the kind that should have shielded her, had instead blinded her to the monster her son had become. The emotional punch hit hardest during Junior's trial, where he stood in front of the court, apologizing for his actions with a veneer of remorse that most people saw through immediately. His words, hollow and rehearsed, did nothing to soothe the pain of a family that had been destroyed by his cruelty. The apology he offered was nothing more than a way to lessen his sentence, to garner sympathy from the jury. In that moment, the magnitude of Junior's manipulation became clear. He hadn't just killed Margaret. He had destroyed an entire family. He had twisted the love and trust of those closest to him into weapons, using them to shield himself from the consequences of his actions. And Margaret, who had always seen the best in her son, had unknowingly played into his hands. What remained in the wake of Margaret's death was not just the grief of losing her, but the weight of the choices she had made. The choice to defend Junior, to protect him from the consequences of his actions, had led to her own demise. And it had all been enabled by her love. The realization hit everyone involved in the case. Margaret's love for her son had been her undoing. He had allowed Junior to manipulate, control, and ultimately destroy the one person who had always believed in him. A mother's love blinded her to the monster her son had become. What was left to save? This wasn't just a question about Junior. It was a question about all the missed opportunities, all the moments when the truth was almost visible but ignored. What could have saved Margaret? What could have stopped Junior from becoming the monster he was? There was no simple answer, but in the end, the only thing left to save was a broken family, one that had been torn apart by the very thing that should have kept them whole: love. And now, all that remained was the painful process of trying to heal from a wound that had been inflicted not by an outsider, but by their own flesh and blood. The investigation had come to a heart-wrenching conclusion, but the aftermath left a stain that would forever mark the Sumney family. 3 haunting images from the crime scene, imprinted on the minds of those who had witnessed them, became symbols of Junior's manipulative cruelty. These were the snapshots of a man who had lost every shred of empathy, and whose pride in his sickening actions only served to deepen the tragedy. The first image was the most chilling: Junior's selfie, standing next to his mother's lifeless body. His expression was unnervingly calm, even smug, as he posed beside the woman he had just murdered. The normality of his face, contrasting so violently with the horror behind him, made the photo all the more grotesque. There was no panic, no guilt, just a calculated smile. It was as though he had accomplished a task marking his success. The second image was the sickle weapon that had been so meticulously placed outside the bathroom, its blade glinting with dark stains. It wasn't just a weapon, it was a message. The sickle was too deliberate in its placement. Junior had used it not in a fit of rage, but as a tool in his premeditated plan. The scene was carefully staged, an act of violence transformed into a twisted form of art, framed for the world to see, and yet shrouded in a web of lies. The third image was the blood-smeared scene, a room that had once been filled with the warmth of family, but had now been turned into a chaotic spectacle of death. The bloodstains were not just on the floor. They were everywhere, on the walls, the towels, the items in the room. Junior had staged the scene with a level of detail that spoke volumes about his cold-hearted nature. Every step was a mark of careful execution, as if the blood of his own mother was nothing more than a tool to make his crime perfect. Each of these images played a role in unraveling the truth of Junior's actions, but together they painted a portrait of a man who had lost all humanity. The images, though horrifying, were the key to exposing the depths of his manipulation. But the true cost of those images was borne by Margaret's family, the memories of a mother who had been both a victim and an unwitting accomplice in her son's crime. Margaret's tragic fate stands as a stark reminder of the dangers of enabling destructive behavior. Her unwavering love for her son, though admirable in its purest form, ultimately blinded her to the reality of his actions. The danger of unchecked love, love that refuses to acknowledge the darkness within, is something that many can relate to. We often find ourselves forgiving those we love, overlooking their faults and hoping for their redemption. But in Margaret's case, that very love became her downfall. Her tragic death wasn't just the result of Junior's violence. It was the culmination of years of enabling, of turning a blind eye to warning signs that were too glaring to ignore. Her deep devotion to Junior, while meant to protect him, ended up becoming a shield for his dangerous behavior. No amount of love could undo the consequences of her decisions, and it was this painful truth that haunted the entire family. The lesson in Margaret's story isn't just about the dangers of parental love gone unchecked. It's about the consequences of failing to recognize the signs of destructive behavior in those we care about. When we allow someone to escape the consequences of their actions, we don't just hurt them. We hurt ourselves and those around us. Margaret's story is a powerful lesson in the importance of boundaries, the need to confront difficult truths, and the painful reality that sometimes love isn't enough to save someone who has chosen a path of destruction. As the family tries to heal from this devastating loss, they are left to pick up the pieces of their shattered lives with no answers to the most important question of all. Why? Why did Junior resort to murder? What drove him to take such drastic, irreversible actions? And perhaps more importantly, why did no one intervene sooner? What are your thoughts on Junior's trial and his sentence? Do you think the punishment fit the crime, or was the justice system too lenient in the face of his calculated actions? Drop your comments below and let's discuss this disturbing case together. In our next video, we'll uncover another chilling true crime story that slipped through the cracks of justice. Stay tuned as we explore the depths of human nature and the darkness that can often lie behind closed doors.